All right. So I think everyone's in from the waiting room. I want to let everyone know right now that there is a group of folks from LA that are taking part, or in LA that are taking part with CS EdCon. So we have an in-person and a virtual audience here. So just so everyone kind of knows what's going on. For those of you that are online, I'll add this to the chat for some instructions for how you may want to rename yourself to help us keep track of things. And are we all good to get going? Okay, awesome. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel. My name is Ian Hermany-Horses. I am the moderator. I'm an assistant teaching professor at CU Boulder. And I focus on computer science ed and math ed and kind of the whole spectrum of things within education. I work with pre-service teachers in my role at CU Boulder, but then also do, PD support for practicing teachers, and then work with K-12 students as well. And I'm gonna let each of our panelists introduce themselves. I see Elisabeth first, so maybe we could start off with you.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Elisabeth Holm. I'm the founder of SONAC, which is the Sisterhood of Native American Coders. But usually we just kind of shorten it to SONAC because it's kind of a mouthful. Yeah, and I guess just kind of a little bit of background. I've been coding and kind of been an advocate for women in STEM for the past 7 years. And I started SONAC because I wanted to kind of connect my passion with STEM with my Indigenous ancestry. So that's just kind of a bit of background.
Zoe, would you mind going next?
Kia ora, ko Porongia te Maunga, ko Waipa te Awa, no Ireland, no Scotland, no Togo, toku tipuna, no Tangatiriti Ahau, ko Kai Whakahaere o OMGTech, ko Zoe Timbrell toku ingoa, ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei. So Porongia is the mountain I grew up under, Waipa is the river I grew up beside. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My ancestors are from Ireland, Scotland, and Togo. I'm a tauiwi in Aotearoa, and I'm committed to the partnership of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I'm the founder of OMGTech, and I acknowledge the tangata whenua of the area that I am on today. OMGTech is a charity in Aotearoa, New Zealand that was established about 7 years ago to ensure every child or young person gets access to the technology that shapes their future. We have a focus on ensuring young people can think creatively, critically, computationally, and culturally. And we believe that exploring all of our own indigeneity is the key to a prosperous future for everybody.
Thank you. Jen, would you mind going next?
Yes, happy to. Hello, everybody. My name is Jennifer Flanagan. I am joining from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I also called Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, so the capital of Canada. And I'm the CEO of an organization called Actua. We are a national charitable organization that engages youth in building the skills and confidence they need to thrive in STEM, but generally across the board. We specifically focus on removing barriers that continue to exist for participation in these fields. And our largest program is the work that we do in partnership with Indigenous communities, so First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across Canada. So very happy to be here.
Yes, it's my turn.
You. Yeah, you go for it.
So I just greeted you in my native language of Nupiaq. Hey everyone, my name is Frieda, or you can call me Nupiaq, which is my Nupiaq name. I'm here on traditional territories of the Lishan and Chochenyo Ohlone people. I'm going to go ahead and drop the Show Me Land Tax link into the chat. If you live in the Bay Area, if you've been in the Bay Area, you don't have to be in the Bay Area to support Indigenous rematriation of the land. So that's one way to do it as an ally. So yeah, I've been with the Kapor Center for nearly 7 years. It'll be 7 years in January. And for the past 2 of them, I've been co-leading a project with the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. Similar to Elisabeth, I've been working with Native girls in computing. The model's slightly different. We're working to bring in culturally revitalizing computing education curricula into Native serving schools designed specifically to engage Native girls. And I came to that work because I did my CS and bachelor's, my bachelor's in CS, and it was, as a Native American woman, as a Native Alaskan woman, it was so challenging in so many different ways. And so to understand that, I started to work on better representation for Black and other Indigenous people and women in STEM and in CS.
All right, thank you all. So we'll get into our first question. Quick reminder, the goal is 3 minutes apiece, and we'll kind of round robin it. So the first question is, in your experience, what has been the biggest challenge of doing CS Ed work with and or in Indigenous communities? And I'll throw that in the chat as well to help you out. Anybody like to take that on first?
I'm happy to go first if you want.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. So and obviously speaking from a Canadian context, we've got two pretty significant challenges. I mean, many challenges, but two in particular that I'm going to speak about. One is this, that I think will be very common among panelists and certainly understood among the audience, which is just a significant and growing digital divide. So, straight up access. We know that, the access to the internet is been designated by the UN as a human right. Canada is obviously a very super developed country, but we still have massive access issues. So rural remote communities, only about half have actual access to high-speed broadband. And in our Indigenous communities across the country, about 3/4 of them don't have access to reliable internet. So that's just internet access. Then technology and hardware is a whole other challenge. So one that we kind of work around. So we do a lot of unplugged activities in computer science. And through the pandemic, this has been massively exacerbated because of the challenges of connecting to communities that we normally connect with face-to-face to do this content, where we bring in technology, really not being able to do that. The other piece is around the cultural divide and the ongoing focus, which is still important, on access and physical infrastructure, which is needed, but a real lack of focus on how we build from the very core, build in Indigenous perspective and leadership in how content and computing systems are actually designed. So a big part of the work that we're doing is really to create a platform and space for changing the way that CS education is developed, so that the unique and critical perspectives of Indigenous people are brought into it. Many of the Indigenous communities we work with are nervous or kind of resisting in terms of the digital evolution, and for good reason, because they don't see themselves in it. And certainly from a youth perspective, they're in Canada anyway, there's a huge focus on revitalizing and maintaining and celebrating traditional culture and language. So that's a big gap that we're also working very actively to address through the way that we incorporate multiple worldviews in the programming that we deliver. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to jump in? Again, the question is, in your experience, what has been the biggest challenge of doing CS Ed work with and or in Indigenous communities?
I can hop in next if you'd like.
Sounds good.
And apologies, my voice is a little bit shaky because we're a little under the weather right now. But yeah, so I guess one of the big issues is having kind of a concentrated initial interest in CS. So, there's obviously two formats of in-person and online, or like over Zoom. And SONAC personally, so we teach Indigenous girls around the country how to code, and we are an online-based platform. But what we found is that there's quite a diverse kind of range of girls from, they're from a bunch of different tribes, but that also kind of shows us that there's not a lot of, there's not a concentrated interest in CS in, one specific area or tribe. It can be maybe 1 to 2 girls per area. And I think for CS programs in general, I think it's really important to have a kind of that in-person connection and be coding alongside other girls. That's kind of like what makes it engaging and fun. But I think with the online platform, it can be a little bit tough to do that. But you kind of have to strike a balance between having that more engaging in-person program and like kind of working with your peers. But also Native communities usually don't have enough interest to make a substantial program within one area or tribe. So I feel like that's something that we've kind of, we've overcome with the online format, bringing together girls onto a virtual space, but it's been definitely hard to kind of have that connection that you usually would with a traditional kind of CS or STEM program, where they're doing projects together, working alongside each other, and kind of helping each other out and making those computer science triumphs together. Yeah, so it can definitely be a tough balance between the group work and that kind of collaboration, and also kind of bringing together Native communities. But yeah, that's about it.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in and piggyback off of what has already been said, just from like a very basic like Native perspective. I feel like Native communities are still undergoing quite a lot of genocide, and that's not something I'm sure that's new to the Native folks here, but that's not the narrative that's discussed in education often. So what I tend to talk about is that my mother was a boarding school survivor. This is something that impacted her life and lifespan, and has impacted me as intergenerational trauma. So we don't often like see education and schooling as part of that narrative of colonization. And so we're tending to couch it in different terms, right? You can hear terms about cultural difference or, this kind of lack of access of things, which is true. But seen from a Native perspective, these are all parts of the ways that we're still enduring under difficult conditions, right? Under conditions of colonization. So, that can be, some of our school sites have had, issues like environmental disasters, over this past year, fires when there shouldn't be fires, or floods when they're normally not floods, tornadoes that they've never had. So, they're going through a lot just on a physical level, even that's disrupting a lot of their school life as well, and just their family structure. So that's part of it. I think the cultural part that Elisabeth and Jen talked about, I think the thing that we're seeing on the ground with the schools that we're working with is that there's a huge interest on the part of the Native students to connect with their traditional cultures. And again, school has often been the opposite experience for them, right? Of being acculturated and assimilated into different disciplines that are led by white folks. But here we're trying to integrate traditional knowledges on a tribe by tribe basis into computing curricula. And that means working much more closely with the tribe and understanding their concerns, their desires for their kids, their young people. What do they want to see for their future? And how do they want to see them in the world? So it's a very different approach. And I think, really tries to get to grips with this, reversing this, the colonization aspect of school, trying to at least get at some of that. You can't completely in a school setting, probably for lots of reasons, but trying at least to bring back language, bring back traditions. In some cases, the tribes we're working with were matriarchies originally before colonization, right? So working with Native girls is a part of that focus of, well, this is actually a traditional part of your tribe in some cases. So yeah, these are some of the things that we're trying to bring into the work, but I appreciate all that everyone said. It's definitely, I'm just trying to frame it in a way, I think if there are any Native folks on the call joining us today, that they'll maybe understand a little bit of what we're trying to do.
Zoe, go ahead and jump in.
Okay, yeah, so just to totoko that, for us in Aotearoa, the biggest problem with CS education is that it's a microcosm of the biggest problem in general education, and that it's our education systems are incredibly colonized. And you can't just tinker around the edges and change a few things. 90% of our Indigenous young people go to school in mainstream schools. So we have Māori kura kaupapa, which are incredible places of learning, but the majority of our Indigenous young people don't get to have that kind of education. And so until we really look at not just culturally responsive practice and education, but culturally sustaining, where our young people have success as Māori themselves, and that's not success, Māori being successful, it's success as Māori, success as Samoan, as Tongan in these spaces. And our teaching workforce is on a really big journey, and we're very fortunate in Aotearoa that our Ministry of Education has recognised this and is putting focus into it, but it's a really big thing to look at and face into all of our own unconscious biases, how that plays out and what we value in education. There's a really cool bit of work by Dr. Anne Milne, who is a lead educator in Aotearoa around colouring in the white spaces. And she's got one for digital that looks at colouring in your digital white spaces, which is a training course to make you really face into how much your whole school, the way that your website looks, the way that everything looks is recolonizing our students. So for us, the biggest challenge is just the biggest educational challenge. How do we ensure that everything we're doing isn't recolonizing and doing more harm? How are we being critical of ourselves and our teaching? And we work with a large percentage of schools in Aotearoa. I'm looking at that question, looking at how do we all continue to, because it has to be the mainstream, and we can't just tinker and create little bits here anymore, because it's about every young person. Yeah, so I think that would be for us the biggest challenge in CS, biggest challenge in everything.
If I could also just jump in, I feel like a really important part of designing the CS curriculum or STEM curriculum is to incorporate that Indigenous kind of heritage and culture into it. You know, it could be something as small as using an Indigenous word as an example. Like if you just have to plug in some random word, it could be some Indigenous word. But I think, yeah, a really important part of kind of maintaining that heritage is kind of an easy integration between the like kind of Indigenous side and the STEM side, because they don't have to be separate. And in doing that, you can kind of show them how they can apply what they're learning in CS or STEM back into their communities, and kind of connecting it back to their own heritage.
Thank you all. I'm gonna try to pull us up now from here, where like challenges are daunting in a way, but that we have to have successes that come out of these, right? And we're working within these systems, and you know, there are bright shining lights. So what has been the greatest success you have seen either in your own organization's work or in the larger work with CS education in Indigenous communities? Anybody that wants to jump in?
I could go first again. Okay, I love what all the other panelists said so much, and just in Canada, for example, you know, we're working on a massive. Canada is working on a massive reconciliation priority or focus. It's a huge, as it is in other jurisdictions in the world, a huge topic of conversation and energy and momentum. And we specifically design and build our work around the recommendations that came out of a large commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There were over 90 calls to action for the government to take on, and a section of that was around education and language preservation. And so we work directly under the direction of Indigenous leaders in this country. We also sort of work at both ends of, some of my colleagues on the panel have spoken about. We take the view of one kid at a time, one child at a time, because it's overwhelming. There's so much work to do, but one child at a time, but also how do we change the system? We can't do the work unless we're working as well on the system. We also, as an organization, can't do the work unless we as an organization walk the reconciliation talk ourselves. So that means significant Indigenous representation from our board to our staff, to the people that we work with on the ground, to the companies that we work with. So our programs are all led by Indigenous undergraduate students across the country. So that has been a huge success for us because there's a huge amount of competition for those students. So we have been able to engage a lot of them in the delivery of these programs. And we've been doing this work for, goodness, since I was in undergrad, so like 25 years ago. And what our goal is to build a continuum of support for these youth. So they might see a workshop in a school, they might have a summer program in digital skills and STEM in their community. Then they have the opportunity to see us again at school. They then, as they get older, can become an instructor or a volunteer in one of our programs. And we're now actually taking that a step further where we're doing land-based programming. It's a huge area of focus for us. So actually taking our content and going out with youth for 15 days, it's just an example, where youth are getting high school credits. So they're actually getting formal school credits. They are being paid to then kind of mentor and do the work with younger youth. They're getting leadership training. And then the step after that is that we actually work to get them internships, like work integrated learning type things. So that could be with a corporation that they're interested in, that could be with a local community-based organization. So it's recognizing that, we do, if we want to see the kind of systems change that we're out for, have to provide that support along the way. And all of it is at the direction and design of our Indigenous partners and our Indigenous staff. So we're changing the system as we deliver the programming on the ground.
Thank you. Who would like to go next in terms of sharing a greatest success or positive things you're seeing in CS Ed in Indigenous communities?
I'll just add one tiny thing. I think, yeah, I mean, we definitely, it's been challenging getting this started over the pandemic. But I would say that something that gives me a lot of heart is part of the challenge of the pandemic has been that students were working at home the first year. And so all of their classes were virtual, and we had to send kits individually home for them to work on their CS projects. But one of the beauty points of that was that they actually had a chance to show their relatives, and often it lived in intergenerational households. So it was like aunties and grandparents also seeing what they could do with these LED light strips they got to play with or make beadwork on, or, had their culturally, at the time we were using the culturally relevant model of curriculum development, not culturally revitalizing. But yes, they enjoyed showing off what they could do. And one student in a sharing circle we had on the site the end of last year had said that when he was, doing his project in his room or, out in the living room, somebody came by, his auntie came by and said, what are you doing? And watched him do his thing, watched the lights blink and flash and how he was explaining, how it worked. And she just looked at him and said, yeah, good. Make it think like an Apache, like make that computer think like an Apache. And that was such a beautiful moment for us as a team, because we realized that, this is an opportunity for elders, for family members, for parents, for intergenerational learning to happen, for younger siblings to get a chance to be exposed to this at the same time. And it's a more sort of community-wide effect than we would have seen otherwise. So really appreciated that comment from that auntie. And also just the vision that it gave us, right? The sort of alignment it gave us about what we're trying to do, right? In terms of what Elisabeth was talking about and others here talking about using Indigenous languages in coding. There's no need for it to be in English, right? It comes down to binary code at the end of the day. So, coding in their language, things like that they can show others that they're learning how to do two things at the same time makes their families incredibly proud.
Yeah, thank you. Like that is a particular challenge, right? Where there's not a lot of visibility of computer science within the communities, right? There's a recognition that it's important and we want students to expose it, but raising that level of understanding across the entire community is always a challenge. And so, yeah, the little blessing underneath the mess of the pandemic there. Zoe, Elisabeth, greatest things you've seen going on, successes? I see you unmuted, Zoe. Go ahead.
So in Aotearoa, one of the biggest successes generally has been around language revitalization as a tool for cultural revitalization. So the Māori people of Aotearoa almost lost their language completely. And there was a big effort generally for language revitalization in the 80s that is really flourishing now. A lot of work we do feeds onto that, that Frieda was just talking about, that the computers don't speak English, computers speak binary, and we speak English to computers. And that there's an awful lot of ideas that cannot be translated into English because they just don't exist in it, particularly coming from our Indigenous people. So we do a lot of work around identity in computing, around being really critical of what you're being served up in a digital space and when you're creating with technology. We have an Indigenous game design course that unpacks the values that exist in technology. We find that really successful with young people using gaming as a tool to look at the fact that technology is not valueless. It's not this cold artifact, that it has and represents the values of the people that created it. And so for our wider whānau mindset, we talk a lot about whose values do you want represented in the things that are controlling our future. So looking at how our healthcare system will work as technology comes into it more and more, as our democracy works. And where do these value systems come from? And often we talk about the difference between American values in the private healthcare sector versus Aotearoa, where we have a public healthcare sector. And what's that robot that's caring for your auntie or your grandma going to look like, and how is it going to interact? Because like you said, like give it an Apache mindset, give it a Pacific mindset, because they're very different. And the idea of what that technology should do comes from a different place. So we've found a lot of success in helping our Indigenous communities really understand they can change technology to be representative of themselves. And the first stage of that has been around that deconstruction of it, and being able to say, particularly for our young people, they hop into these video games like Fortnite. What are the values represented in that, and how do they align to who you are? And are you becoming a different person in a digital world from who you are? And how would you fix that? Like, what would you do instead? And so our young people create the most incredible games in the world. They're just super cool because they're representative and they're being allowed to represent themselves. And then the other side of that is around the resource creation. And we've heard lots of people mention it. So we've done a lot of work as the Code.org partner in Aotearoa and working alongside Microsoft for years to translate the Hour of Code site into Te Reo Māori. We believe that for our young people, their first experience coding should be in their Indigenous language. This year, we're going to be translating into some of our Pacifica languages as well, because that also allows them to take that back into their homes for their aunties and their parents and their grandparents who have these traditional, who speak first language and Indigenous languages. And so then they can share in that, because it's quite a big gap, that whānau connection to technology can be very big. So that's kind of where our biggest success has been, and is really just that helping our young people be critical of the technology that they're served up and create better solutions.
Thank you. I like the idea of like your first experience should be something that is of you, right? Something where you come from, right? This can be part of you. Awesome. Elisabeth, would you like to share a great success you're seeing within your work or in others' work that you're noticing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Jen might have mentioned kind of looking at things on an individual level, like each individual girl. I think one of the greatest successes, or I guess the most rewarding moments, is when you see that kind of that moment of switch in the girls, when their eyes just light up and they see the code running and doing that kind of computer magic right before their eyes. I think they have this moment of like, I did that, I'm smart, I'm capable, I'm a coder. And I think that moment is really just, it's what all coders live for, but I think like particularly as an educator, that is just such a rewarding moment. And I think to be able to create that moment in as many girls as possible is really the goal of SONAC and other you know, kind of CS education programs. I think through SONAC, we've been able to genuinely change some girls' outlook on STEM. And with even just one girl, we can kind of start a chain of the next generation of Indigenous female innovators in STEM. So I feel like even though it seems small to change just one girl's mindset, you know, they're going to pass that on to their little sister or their friend. Or when they get older, maybe they'll start a program kind of similar to SONAC to spread their passion. So I think those individual sparks, they seem sometimes, you know, they seem a little bit on a smaller scale, but they can really start a wildfire. And I think that's probably one of the biggest impacts that we can have.
Yeah, like we in like these very formal, informal roles, right? But in some way we're separated, right? And that peer support or that peer guidance and like, what could this mean for you, my friend, or my cousin, or whoever, is just so powerful. And we just can't speak and have those conversations in the positions that we're in a lot of times. Yeah, so incredibly powerful. Okay, so I want to, we're gonna, Jen, do you have a comment?
Oh, I just wanted to say one more thing that is kind of like that in terms of sparks. Like one of the most amazing things that happened, and this is pre-pandemic, we'll get back this summer, I hope, but we deliver programming with the 24 communities across Nunavut, which is one of our northern Arctic territories, with Inuit people. And it's delivered completely in Inuktitut, or it's delivered in English, but translated completely in Inuktitut as well. Some of the kids understand, some of them are just learning, some of them don't understand at all, but they're getting there. And we always have local elders engaged in our programs. And for the last few years, we have had like the most incredible experiences having elders become so engaged in the content. And in fact, as they're doing it, are kind of co-teachers. So they're taking the cultural lessons and sort of laying those on top of the work that our team is delivering around STEM or around, digital skills. And it's incredibly powerful, but it is just, to me, one of the biggest things that we need to continue to facilitate is that intergenerational, multi-generational experience, and where we just sort of create the space and, the rest happens at the community level.
Yeah, community is a driving thing here, right? Like you get the community on board and it becomes part of them. Thank you all. I'm going to transition us to questions now. I'm going to first pivot to the people in the room at CS EdCon. Are there any questions from that space?
Can y'all hear us still?
Yes, very clear.
One second. My question is there any organization out there that is working with the tribal elders, getting their input, or the tribal leaders? I know there's a lot of work at the school level, but I think there'd be more success if the elders were included in a lot of these decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit what I was alluding to when we talked about cultural revitalization. You can't do that without elders and culture bearers and language bearers. And I think they play a critical role in part of what we're trying to do here. What some of us have talked about, just building something new in place of colonial education, something more holistic, community-based, Indigenous-centered, Indigenous worldview centered. And so, yeah, that's definitely what cultural revitalization has brought to my program, is more work with the folks who immediately when you meet them, they want to tell you stories. Immediately when you meet them, they're excited because we're both Native, and when you meet them, they're just they're brimming with the possibilities for what we can do together. How we can move forward. And taking their community, their young folks, on a journey with them to reconnect with those parts of the past that we want to bring with us. So I think those are the folks that we work with in the tribal communities that we're with, and part of that is the tribal governance itself. So one of our tribal partners has a culture committee. We're working with them to create some of the cultural pieces. In other areas, they have a culture and language curriculum inside of the school, and we're working with the teachers there. So it just depends on the community. But yeah, absolutely. Elders are critical. They're a critical part of the vision, for sure. Thank you for the question.
So in Aotearoa, we're very fortunate with our new education changes that they've said every school has to go work with the mana whenua, the local people of the area. But one thing that we would say is that often that work is seen as being free cultural labor, that there's an expectation that the local tribes should, for free, come every single time they're asked and provide that knowledge over and over again, which isn't right and isn't true. So when anyone's planning this stuff, we have to think about how we're valuing that knowledge and that relationship, and who should be doing the work, and how much education we have to do ourselves first before we just go ask. So that's that's currently where we are today in New Zealand, is going on that journey of how do we value that and not just expect it, because it's not like they're getting paid to do it. So how do we pay for that knowledge if we want it, in many ways?
I co-sign that. The payment part is usually forgotten in those things. Yeah, we built it into our grant, but it's definitely something to keep reminding folks of, that there's a real value to Indigenous knowledge of all fields and all types.
Yeah, we have long been paying for elder engagement, and at any time. It's never a question. Just to the question that was asked. And I'll share the link, but we last year did a series of roundtables right across the country with elders and knowledge keepers and chiefs and council and all forms of different leadership to talk about land-based learning specifically, and how land-based learning and STEM and coding could all come together, not just for Indigenous youth, but for all youth. And that a report was produced out of that, in terms of that kind of voice being captured, and then our role is then to share that up to the leadership, whether that's at the government level, federally, so or provincially where education is held in Canada. So I'm happy to share the findings of that report.
So we'd like to take the next question from the Zoom room. I put it in the chat, but just wanted to give a shout out. If anyone has one, they may feel free to unmute and ask a question. Otherwise, I'll give you all a question.
And we also have a second question from the room if you want to take that one too, from LA.
Okay, let's take the question from LA. Anyone in the Zoom room, please feel free to throw something in there and we'll do our best to get to it. We still have some time here for questions.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jeremy. I'm faculty at the University of Arizona. I'm also a member of the Hopi Tewa community, so I appreciate your insight. I really actually value the idea of thinking critically and how we take up this particular kind of work in our communities. And I really appreciate the sort of the centering and reminding us of the intersections between settler colonialism and that history, but also the possibilities of what this kind of work holds. So I'm brand new to this, so I really appreciate the dialogue that you're shaping. For me, it meshes well for me in terms of critical Indigenous pedagogies and culturally sustaining pedagogies as well. So my question revolves around what are the sort of the processes in which you engage the ethical balance in terms of what knowledge should or shouldn't be included in this process, and how is that protected in terms of under the lens of, let's say, maybe sovereignty or tribal self-determination, et cetera? I'm
chomping at the bit to answer that. This is something that we have a Native woman-led team in my project, and we were really wanting to know what were the protocols for that tribe before we started incorporating knowledge and language. And it came up in some of our earlier conversations. For some tribes, using their language in a computer machine context doesn't work. They don't want their language to be used that way, which we have to respect. I mean, that makes total sense, right? How did colonizers get all of our stuff and keep it, right? They used technology, so we didn't have. So, I think there's this question, about like, where are the lines? And we always want to respect those. We also had conversations, about, specific aspects of the language. So is it like words? Is it the syllabary? Is it both? We want to be very clear with folks, and we respect their protocols, 100%. And I think it was Zoe's point where we have to learn ourselves. We're coming from outside as well. We're from different tribes. So, when we go and approach people, we have to read up about their culture and their language and their ways. When I go to Mescalero Apache, I'm not pointing with my finger, to anyone. So there's different things that you have to ground yourself in, even if you're just another Native person, just from another part of Turtle Island. So yeah, for sure, 100%. We have to engage with protocol very seriously and make that part of our very gentle relational approach. Like, we approach people as other people. We engage with them non-transactionally. We give them the time they need to respond to us, to come, back with what they need. If we can help them, we will. And, we keep offering. So, there's a lot of working in Native communities. I think for non-Native people isn't intuitive. And so that's something that we try to make a different experience for working with us.
So data sovereignty is huge in this space. And we're very fortunate. Microsoft has just committed to building a data center in Aotearoa because most of our cloud-based data goes offshore constantly. And when we think about where that knowledge is traveling and that localized control over, particularly our Indigenous knowledge, our whakapapa. So they've committed to, and my understanding is they've committed to creating a section of the data center in Aotearoa specifically for the holding of Indigenous knowledge in New Zealand, so that knowledge will never leave the shores of Aotearoa. It won't digitally travel back and forward, which is due to the incredible work within Microsoft of some amazing Indigenous leaders who really understand the narratives and the need behind that. So I would say there are some people out there in some of our large organizations that really get and are really exploring these ideas around how and where Indigenous knowledge should be transmitted. We do a lot of work with our Indigenous community specifically around understanding IP, around understanding how data travels online, like where it is, what does that mean once you've put something, because particularly for our young people, they share so much without really comprehending what that means in terms of their own assets. And then on another note, like even the work that we do around translation, and even with the work we've done with the Hour of Code, there is no one Māori language. There is Te Reo Māori. We have different languages in every tribe. And so even in these spaces, we're almost colonizing with one tribe. The tribes that we work with our translations on become the standard online, and that's still not right, because there are so many different ways of saying and being. And so I think that we all need to consistently put pressure on these systems to really understand what the Indigenous space is in technology, and how we allow that to be reflected, not just with here are the flags of countries, but actually being able to understand the nuance of, that. One other project we worked on is we have a Tokelauan community here. Tokelau's an island in the Pacific that is on the endangered language list. And we've been working for 3 years with the elders and the young people of the Atahu Tokelau community in Porirua to develop a language app, because they see technology as a great revitalization tool. But it's really hard to consistently take all of the ways of being and working alongside our Indigenous elders that don't have experiences in tech. And even though we've built language apps with other Indigenous people, even our Indigenous developers had to still take themselves out to really explore and understand that Indigenous knowledge. Like, what is it to learn when you're from the island of Atahu? How do the elders want to communicate that without assuming that it's these ways of being? So it just takes a huge amount of awareness to do this work for people in this space. And I think everyone has to be constantly aware of what they're bringing into it so that they don't dominate it.
Yeah, I just want to, this is a conversation that's been happening within natives in tech around data sovereignty, and it is also part of like an infrastructure issue, right? On one hand, we talk about the cultural knowledge and how that gets incorporated into educational systems, but how do we ensure that, tribal citizens and tribal systems have physical control over what they choose to use and really have that in place? So it's, physical systems, it's also, right, maybe a first refusal or licenses around data. And these are things that I think are necessary to kind of be brought up to speed around, what happens in the greater publishing or technological world around how we share things and use other people's stuff. Open source is kind of a gold standard within the software community. Well, maybe not gold standard. I'm a huge fan of open source, but that doesn't quite work when we talk about protecting, our own knowledge spaces and how we want things to work and how we want people to be able to take them up or not take them up.
There's a really cool company, Aho, they're an amazing Indigenous data company in Aotearoa, and they, even looking at things like whakapapa, which is your ancestors, and that idea that there's no empty fields, it's not missing knowledge, that your whakapapa is there and it exists, and but that also your whakapapa can be disagreed on within a tribe, and what truth is in data, because computer science is so binary. But actually these ideas and these structures for data storage and whose truth is right and valid, even within your own tribe, is a really interesting space that will, again, radically transform what our data, what computers look like for the better, I think.
Ian, I just popped a resource to you into the chat around, there's an organization in British Columbia called the First Nations Technology Council, and they're doing a lot of work around digital equity, but also including like spectrum sovereignty. So like who actually owns the kind of like space in the internet, and you know, we're working actually to do some programming around actually getting kids to understand that, so that they can start to understand that kind of potential in the future. So I put the link in the chat.
Thank you. And that's technologycouncil.ca/indigenous-leadership-in-tech-technology for those of you in the room. And I think we might be able to share something out like that later. And I also want to, so you brought up an interesting thing where like, what is right and what isn't. And in some ways, right, like I can kind of speak for my people where there is no really right or wrong, right? This is what I was taught. And part of the cultural thing is, you know, okay, that's what you were taught, and I acknowledge that. And I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. And so it's a remnant of colonization in some spaces to say this is right or wrong. And that is difficult, interesting, all of the things to navigate when we talk about trying to standardize and share and make something that works for everybody. So it's kind of blows up a lot of things that we think are standard assumptions. And I think we have a question from the chat, and I think it'd be great to end from Penny. Are you able to ask your question?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
I am in North Dakota. I work on at a small tribal school, and we are at the very beginning of this whole process. We had issues with internet when the pandemic hit. We just recently got enough devices to be one-to-one with our students. But what would you guys recommend be the first steps that we take? Because I mean, we do not have a lot of teachers. I mean, we're short teachers this year. Being able to staff positions to teach these things, because I mean, a lot of the schools are already behind in reading and math. And I know that reading and math can be taught within CS curriculum, but what would you guys recommend be those first steps so that we can move in the right direction? Sorry, I'm out of breath. We have parent teacher conferences and I just had a parent walk in. So, but go ahead.
Do you want to take that up? First steps you think people could take where, you know, they may be under-resourced or, you know, trying to figure out how to start?
Well, I mean, I think one of the beauties of the like the internet and kind of the kind of the amount of resources that we have there is that we have access to a lot of you know, free online kind of teaching resources. There's Khan Academy, there's like various things. And I think that is definitely one thing that we could, like you guys could utilize going forward to kind of fill in those gaps, you know, those kind of recordings of, you know, someone else teaching it. But I think it is definitely hard because, you know, not every student has the same access to tech. And that's kind of one of the issues that that we face in Indigenous communities is that access to a computer or the internet. So I think those online resources are a great way to kind of fill in those gaps if you can. Like if you have access to the internet and those resources, but I think there's definitely it's a tough issue to solve.
If you have access to the internet, it's a great place to start. As easy as Hour of Code. We start all our schools off with that it's a self-led for your students, and there's so many of them on there, and it's super rich, but it is very what it is. When we work with schools, we always do projects. So just project-based learning outside of everything else, give them something they can connect to in their community and just let them think about a solution. And they don't have to build a technology solution, but if they're exploring some of those concepts, we do a lot of stuff around, like, you know, if we've got assistive issues in our school or environmental issues, is there a stream? Is there something that they can think about? And then depending on the age of the kids, we do a lot of game design because kids love making games. Again, there's lots of free resources out there. We use Scratch. We try to use only free stuff. I know in America, my understanding is it's a little bit different of what tech you can use in your school. So it's a bit, but no, we in Aotearoa, we can just say, go use this, and you can just do it. The level of state control is, I guess, a little bit less. But yeah, Scratch is super cool. The Code.org stuff is amazing for self-led stuff for your students. But really, you have to get their hearts and get them interested in it with something that they're passionate about. So project-based stuff that takes all of that other stuff into account, I would say.
Penny, what age are your kids or grades?
We actually are a pre-K. We have 2 schools within our building. We are a BIE pre-K through 8th grade. And then we also have a public high school that is also on our reservation.
Awesome. I mean, we'd be interested in talking about partnering on the high school. So, I mean, that's one thing is partnerships, because there are groups and orgs and projects like mine designed now that like natives are trending in our field. There's unprecedented opportunity, stuff I wish had been around when I was growing up. The other thing I would say, and this gets back to what others have said, is that, yeah, I would see what their interests are and go with what they already like doing with technology. Often it is gaming, like was said, but I think everyone's a gamer at all ages, always, no matter what the game. But I do think, yeah, going and polling them too as kids and seeing where their interest is, as well as online resources, trying to think. I know that there are curriculum models out there, trying to think of some of the bigger orgs. Project Lead the Way, I know has been doing a lot as well. There's just so many shops out there. I know that ECS is also applicable to elementary and middle school kids. And I know that there's like a version of that in Code.org, but also the ECS team in LA are folks to maybe think about too. So just tons of opportunity. But thank you for your question. Thanks for your work.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
This is Sandra Papitan, Navajo Res. To the question about internet and no monies and whatnot, of course, all the freebie stuff has been covered. I'd like to plug in for exploring computer science. I facilitated I guess the beginning of computer science, and I began with exploring computer science, Scratch, and also Code.org. But exploring computer science, you can do that without computers. Believe it or not, being in a lecture hall, it's really native friendly. One of my favorite parts about that one is the part where they talk about, there's a lesson plan for problem solving. And we go through the kids have heard that millions of times, right? Problem solving steps, problem solving, but it's very applicable to natives because I can equate that to our Navajo way of living and learning, the 4 directions. And so and the kids are like, oh, okay. So the exploring computer science is really, 1 year I did most of that curriculum without computers. And I think that one was very helpful to me because I'm not a programmer. For some reason, they gravitated toward me just because I'm a good facilitator, I guess. And so, but now our school finally hired a math/computer programmer a teacher. So now that got off my hands. But exploring computer science would be awesome at the BIE school.
And I'll throw out, just as a mention, because I work in academia, I'm working with 2 projects that are South Dakota based, so just south of UPenny. And just as a quick mention for anybody looking for partnerships, look up who's doing the work and just reach out. We're interested in making the world better. And if it's not something we can do, we probably know somebody who is in that space or interested in working in that space. And it all just kind of starts from an email. I met Frieda sitting at a lunch counter one time at a conference. And, you know, you have to build those connections and reach out and say, hey, what's up? And a lot of great stuff happens out of that.
There's another really cool free one we use, which is called Hello Ruby. And it's beautiful for younger kids. And it's all offline, all worksheets that help young people decide, like drawing the internet and stuff like that. I know we're out of time, but Hello Ruby, I thoroughly recommend to everybody.
Developed by a Finnish woman, I think, right? Yeah. I think I saw her keynote once. Really impressive.
Yeah, she's really cool.
Yeah.
Also, just sorry, I know we're running a bit on time, but a quick plug for MIT App Inventor. It's perfect for kids who don't have any experience. It's geared towards a little bit of a younger audience, but it's kind of a drag and drop coding system where they can create their own apps, and you can actually pull it up on your phone. You kind of scan the barcode. So that is just a really cool, easy to use platform. And there are full tutorials for projects. So kids can kind of go through them on their own. They don't need someone to facilitate.
Okay. Thank you all for sharing. We are over time. Great conversation. And thank you everyone for the great questions and for participating. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your work and your thoughts. Yes, seeing stuff in chat. Could use another hour. There are other events going on, I believe, tomorrow. And the Natives in Tech conference is also happening, I believe, starting this evening over the weekend. So again, reach out, please, and we'll figure out what we can do. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone.
All right, great talking to you guys today.